May our fortunes continue to rise, and our legacy endure for generations to come.
In the suffocating humidity of a New Orleans August, in the year 1848, a story that began in the whispered agonies of a sugar plantation reached its ghastly conclusion in the opulent silence of a Garden District mansion. The entire household of the immensely wealthy Creole planter, Jean-Pierre Dubois, was discovered dead. The master himself, his wife, his 2 children, all lay in their beds as if merely sleeping, were it not for the unnatural pallor of their skin and the faint, sweet, cloying odor of decay that had already begun to challenge the scent of jasmine drifting through the open windows. The official cause, hastily declared by a sweat-drenched and fearful family physician, was a fulminant outbreak of cholera, a familiar summer scourge that could fell a family between one sundown and the next. But there were inconsistencies, small, sharp details that pricked at the smooth fabric of the official explanation. There were no signs of the usual violent sickness that accompanied the disease, and the servants, who had shared the same water and air, were inexplicably untouched. One other detail was noted in the constabulary report: a young enslaved woman, a quadroon named Élise, was missing, presumed to have fled into the city's labyrinthine streets during the chaos of her master's sudden demise. To understand the silence that fell over the Dubois mansion on that sweltering day, one must first understand the city that surrounded it. New Orleans in the 1840s was a paradox, a jewel of civilization carved from a malarial swamp, its immense prosperity a direct consequence of its profound moral corruption. It was a city of 3 tiers, a precarious social pyramid built on a foundation of human bondage. At the apex were the white Creoles and the newly arrived Americans, vying for economic and cultural dominance, their lives a whirlwind of masked balls, opera performances, and duels fought under the cathedral-like canopies of ancient oaks. Below them existed the complex and vibrant society of the gens de couleur libres, the free people of color, who navigated a treacherous middle ground, possessing rights and property denied to their enslaved brethren yet forever barred from the full privileges of the ruling class. At the very bottom, bearing the weight of it all, were the enslaved. They were the engine of the city's wealth, the black gold of the sugar and cotton plantations that spread like a verdant stain across the Louisiana Delta. Their world was governed by the brutal calculus of the Code Noir, a set of laws that codified their subjugation, rendering them chattel, property to be bought, sold, bred, and broken at the whim of their owners. The air itself seemed stratified. In the grand houses of the Garden District and the French Quarter, it was thick with the scent of French perfume, roasting coffee, and the sweet perfume of magnolias. But just beyond, in the slave quarters of the plantations like Belle Reve, the air was heavy with the metallic tang of sweat, the acrid smoke of the sugar kettles, and the ever-present miasma of fear. Belle Reve, the Dubois sugar plantation, was a sprawling enterprise a few miles upriver from the city. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and unspeakable cruelty, where fields of sugarcane stretched to the horizon, their green leaves like a million tiny blades under the relentless sun. The Spanish moss that hung from the live oak trees like funeral shrouds was a fitting decoration for a place where lives were consumed as voraciously as the furnaces consumed the cut cane. The system was absolute, a self-perpetuating machine of human suffering designed for a single purpose: to refine the sweet juice of the cane into the hard currency that funded the lavish lifestyles of men like Jean-Pierre Dubois. It was a system that relied not only on the whip and the chain, but on the psychological annihilation of its victims, on convincing them of their own inherent worthlessness, a task at which it was chillingly efficient. Jean-Pierre Dubois was the living embodiment of this system, a man whose entire existence was predicated on the ownership of others. He was a figure of immense power and influence in New Orleans society, a patriarch of an old and respected Creole family whose fortune had been built over generations of such exploitation. In public, he was the model of a Southern gentleman, impeccably dressed, cultured, a patron of the arts, and a devout Catholic who occupied a prominent pew at the St. Louis Cathedral every Sunday. He possessed a cold, aristocratic beauty, with fine-boned features and pale blue eyes that seemed not to see people so much as to appraise them, calculating their value, their utility, their breaking point. Those eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no warmth, only the chilling clarity of a man who had never in his life been told no, a man who viewed the world as a ledger in which some humans were assets and others were liabilities. On his plantation, the genteel facade was stripped away, revealing the tyrant beneath. He was not a man given to fits of rage, his cruelty was far more terrifying for its methodical, dispassionate nature. A whipping was not a punishment delivered in anger, but a calculated business decision designed to maximize productivity. The selling of a family was not a tragedy, but a portfolio adjustment. He was known for his efficiency, a term that, in the lexicon of the planter class, meant he could extract the maximum amount of labor for the minimum amount of sustenance. He was a founding member of a clandestine society of planters known as the Conseil de Sucriers, the Sugar Council, who met monthly in a private room at the St. Louis Hotel to discuss commodity prices, political strategy, and, most importantly, new and more effective methods for the control and suppression of their enslaved workforce. To them, it was a science, and Jean-Pierre Dubois was its master practitioner. Within this world of absolute power and absolute powerlessness moved Élise. To the Dubois family and their guests, she was little more than a piece of decorative furniture that happened to be animate. She was a house slave, chosen for the position because of her light skin, delicate features, and the quiet, almost unnerving grace with which she moved. She was silent, observant, and seemingly docile, her face a carefully constructed mask of subservience that revealed nothing of the furious intelligence that burned behind her dark, watchful eyes. Her official duties involved serving at table, arranging flowers, and attending to Madame Dubois, but her true occupation, the one that consumed her every waking moment, was observation. She saw everything and was seen by no one. She was a ghost in her own life, a silent witness to the casual cruelties and intimate secrets of the family that owned her. Her greatest secret, a treasure more valuable than any of the jewels in Madame Dubois's collection, was her literacy. Her mother, a woman of noble Senegalese birth who had been the favored maid of Jean-Pierre's own mother, had secretly taught her to read and write before being sold downriver after a poor harvest, a portfolio adjustment that had shattered Élise's world. The knowledge of letters was a dangerous, forbidden power, a key to a world beyond the suffocating confines of Bel Rêve. Another hidden skill was her profound knowledge of botany and herbalism, a legacy from an old enslaved woman named Mama Tildy, the plantation's unofficial healer. From Mama Tildy, Élise had learned the secrets of the swamp, which leaves could soothe a fever, which roots could ease a painful birth, and which, if prepared with care, could bring about a quiet and untraceable death. This knowledge, stored away in the vast library of her mind, was another weapon in an arsenal no one knew she possessed. The power dynamic between Élise and her master was a microcosm of the entire Southern order. It was an imbalance so total, so ingrained in the fabric of their existence, that it was as natural and unquestioned as the rising of the sun. She was his property, listed in his will alongside his silverware and his thoroughbred horses. Her body, her labor, her very life belonged to him. The law affirmed this. Society affirmed this. The Church, with its careful sermons on obedience, affirmed this. This absolute control bred in Dubois a profound carelessness. He and his wife, his business associates, and his friends spoke freely in front of Élise, discussing matters of finance, politics, and personal scandal as if she were deaf or simple-minded. They believed her incapable of comprehending the complexities of their world, an assumption that was both their greatest weapon of oppression and their most fatal vulnerability. Élise, polishing the silver as Dubois detailed a plan to ruin a business rival, or arranging flowers as Madame Dubois whispered of her laudanum addiction, was not merely hearing, she was collecting, analyzing, and storing information. Every overheard conversation was a piece of a puzzle, every casual cruelty a drop of fuel added to a slow-burning fire deep within her soul. She learned of his debts, his fears, his contempt for his own son, and the fragile, over-leveraged nature of the great Dubois fortune. She was invisible, and in her invisibility, she found her power. For years, Élise existed in this state of suspended animation, a life of quiet endurance and clandestine learning. The rage she felt was a cold, hard thing, a diamond of hatred she kept buried deep inside, polishing it with every new injustice. But there is a limit to what any soul can bear, a point at which endurance becomes an impossible act. That point arrived not with a cataclysmic event, but with a casual conversation, a few words spoken with the thoughtless cruelty that was the Dubois family's birthright. Jean-Pierre's son, Antoine, was a pale imitation of his father. He possessed all of his father's cruelty but none of his cold self-control. He was a dissolute, arrogant young man who found his primary amusement in the torment of the enslaved. For years, his lecherous gaze had followed Élise, a silent, predatory promise that she had skillfully managed to evade. As Antoine's 21st birthday approached, Jean-Pierre decided it was time to reward his son's passage into manhood. Élise overheard the conversation one evening while serving brandy in the library. "The boy needs to be settled," Dubois said to a fellow planter. "I will give him the girl, Élise, for his own. It is time he started a line. She is of strong stock, and her children should fetch a good price." The word struck Élise with the force of a physical blow. It was not merely the threat of rape, a constant and terrifying reality for every enslaved woman. It was the cold, commercial language, the reduction of her body to a vessel for breeding, the appraisal of her future children as livestock. It was the final, absolute negation of her humanity. In that moment, something inside her, a cord of hope or resilience that had stretched taut for years, finally snapped. The quiet, simmering rage that had been her constant companion for so long now coalesced into a singular, chilling purpose. The mask of docility remained, but behind it, a decision had been made, as irrevocable as a death sentence. She had seen what happened to those who ran. She had seen the posters, the patrols with their dogs, the mutilated bodies of those who were caught. Escape was a fool's hope, a brief, desperate flight into a larger prison. Her mind, sharp and analytical, rejected it. Freedom, she realized with a terrifying clarity, was not enough. Mere escape would leave the system intact, the architect of her misery still reigning over his kingdom of pain. What was required was not escape, but eradication. Justice, she decided, would not be found by fleeing from this house. It would be delivered within its walls. The 2 years that followed were a masterclass in patience and deception. Élise transformed herself into the perfect instrument of her own design. She became more efficient, more silent, more invisible than ever before. She anticipated the family's needs before they were spoken, her movements a fluid, silent ballet of servitude. This heightened performance of subservience was a camouflage, allowing her to move through the house and the plantation with a new, undeclared purpose. Her mind was a ledger, cross-referencing every piece of information she had ever gathered. While mending Madame Dubois's lace, she listened to the society gossip, learning of the family's social vulnerabilities and alliances. While serving at Jean-Pierre's interminable dinner parties, she committed to memory the names of his creditors, the details of his shipping routes, and the precarious state of his investments, which he boasted of with the foolish arrogance of a man who believed himself invincible. She learned that the great Dubois fortune was a house of cards, built on massive debt and risky speculation. He was a man walking a financial tightrope, and a single strong gust of wind could send him plummeting. During this period of intense, covert observation, her resolve was both tested and fortified. The daily litany of cruelties continued unabated. She witnessed a young boy whipped for dropping a plate, a mother forcibly separated from her child on the auction block in the city, an old man worked to death in the sweltering cane fields. Each atrocity was a sharpening of the blade of her intent. She began to take long, solitary walks near the edge of the bayou, ostensibly to gather herbs for the cook or flowers for the house. In reality, she was searching. She was looking for a specific plant Mama Tildy had once shown her, a rare, innocuous-looking vine with a small, pale flower. The old woman had called it le souffle tranquille, the quiet breath. Its root, if prepared correctly, yielded a poison that was slow-acting, cumulative, and diabolically difficult to trace. It mimicked the symptoms of the most virulent forms of cholera or yellow fever, overwhelming the body's systems with a sudden, unstoppable violence. It was the perfect weapon for a world where an enslaved person's testimony was worth nothing, where the word of a white doctor was law. She found the vine, hidden in the deep shade of a cypress grove, and began her work. With the meticulous care of an apothecary, she harvested the roots, drying and grinding them into a fine, tasteless, odorless powder. In the midst of this cold, calculated preparation, an unexpected complication arose in the form of a man named Marcus. He was a field hand, a man of immense physical strength and a spirit that even Dubois's overseers had not managed to completely break. He was intelligent and proud, and he carried his scars, both physical and spiritual, with a defiant dignity. He saw past Élise's carefully constructed facade. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that burned in his own soul. They began to meet in secret, in the brief moments of twilight between the end of work and the ringing of the curfew bell. He spoke of the North, of freedom, of a life where they could be man and wife, not property. His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, a vision of a life she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Come with me, Élise," he would plead in a desperate whisper, his large, calloused hand covering hers. "There are people who can help us. We can be free." Truly free, his love and his offer of escape were a profound temptation, a path away from the darkness she was embracing. But her resolve was absolute. "My freedom is here," she told him, her voice barely audible. "It is not enough to be free of this place. This place must be free of them." There must be a reckoning. He could not understand her refusal, her insistence on a path of confrontation rather than flight, and a painful distance grew between them, a chasm of purpose that even their deep affection could not bridge. Their tragic love story was to be the final catalyst. Dubois, making a tour of the quarters, discovered a tattered copy of a primer, a child's reading book, hidden in Marcus's meager belongings. The sin of a slave learning to read was one of the greatest transgressions, a direct threat to the established order. To make an example of him, Dubois had Marcus whipped until he was barely conscious and then, in a final act of calculated cruelty, sold him to a notoriously brutal cotton plantation in the Mississippi Delta, a place from which no one ever returned. The news of his fate reached Élise in a whisper from another field hand. The loss of Marcus, the snuffing out of that bright, defiant spirit, incinerated the last vestiges of hesitation within her. Her grief was a cold, white-hot furnace, forging her purpose into something as hard and as sharp as forged steel. The night of Antoine Dubois's 21st birthday was the culmination of 2 years of meticulous planning. The family had moved from Belle Reve to their grand mansion in the Garden District for the social season, and the house was ablaze with light and music. It was a lavish affair, a testament to the Dubois family's power and prestige. Society's elite paraded through the grand ballroom, their laughter echoing over the music of the string quartet, oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on the edge of a grave. Élise moved among them, a silent, efficient spectre in a servant's uniform. Her face was a mask of calm impassivity, her hands steady as she refilled glasses and offered trays of hors d'oeuvres. No one noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the only outward sign of the monumental act she was about to commit. Her plan was a masterpiece of patient, methodical herbalism. For months, she had been introducing infinitesimal, harmless traces of a complementary herb into the family's food and water, in the morning coffee, the table salt, the water pitcher that sat on the sideboard. This herb was inert on its own, but it prepared the body, creating a specific chemical pathway that would turn the final, potent dose of le souffle tranquille from a mere poison into an unstoppable cataclysm. The final act was to be the celebratory toast. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10, Jean-Pierre Dubois called for champagne to toast his son and heir. Élise was there, ready. In her pocket, she held a small, intricately carved vial. As she poured the wine for the 4 members of the Dubois family, a swift, practiced movement of her thumb, shielded by the linen napkin draped over her arm, released the fine, white powder into their 4 glasses. For the 2 young children, who would be toasted with sweetened water, she performed a similar sleight of hand. It was done in an instant, an act of silent, deadly precision. She watched them raise their glasses. She watched them drink. The guests departed near midnight, their carriages clattering away into the humid darkness, leaving the house in a state of post-celebratory quiet. The family retired, pleased with the success of the evening. An hour later, the trap was sprung. The first sign was a soft moan from the room of the youngest child, followed by a sharp cry from Madame Dubois. The poison began its work with terrifying speed. It was not a gentle fading, but a violent, internal assault. The physician, a Dr. Renaud, was summoned from his bed. He arrived to a scene of escalating panic. He found the entire family afflicted by a mysterious, hyperaggressive illness. The symptoms were confounding: a raging fever, paralysis creeping up the limbs, and a terrifying clarity in their eyes. They were aware, trapped inside their own failing bodies. Dr. Renaud, a man of science and logic, was utterly baffled. It resembled the most virulent strain of cholera, yet it was progressing at an impossible rate, and it was affecting everyone simultaneously. He was helpless, his medical bag of tinctures and powders useless against this unknown enemy. Arrogant and imperious to the very end, Jean-Pierre Dubois, his body already betraying him, demanded answers, his voice a hoarse rasp. "What is this, Renaud? Do something." But there was nothing to be done. The system he had perfected, the one that had given him absolute control over the lives and deaths of others, had no power here. As the full horror of their situation dawned on the helpless family, Élise began the final phase of her plan. She moved through the house with a calm authority that was terrifying to behold. She sent the other house servants, who were paralyzed with fear, to their quarters in the back, telling them the doctor had ordered a strict quarantine to prevent the spread of the contagion. She locked the doors. Then, she returned to the master bedroom, where Jean-Pierre, his wife, and his son lay in their beds, their bodies racked with the effects of the poison, their minds still horribly lucid. She was no longer the subservient slave. The mask was gone, and the face beneath was that of an avenging angel, her expression a chilling mixture of profound sorrow and implacable resolve. She stood at the foot of Jean-Pierre Dubois's massive four-poster bed, and she began to speak. Her voice, which for years had been trained to be a soft, deferential whisper, was now clear, cold, and resonant with an intelligence they had never imagined she possessed. "You do not have cholera, monsieur," she said, the honorific dripping with icy contempt. "You have justice." She then began to recount his crimes, her memory a perfect, unforgiving ledger. On the 10th of May, 1839, she began, her voice even and methodical, "You sold my mother south to pay a gambling debt. You told my grandmother she had died of a fever." She looked at Madame Dubois. "You wear a pearl necklace, madame, that was purchased with the money from the sale of 3 children from the quarter, their mother's screams a sound you chose to ignore by taking your laudanum." She turned her gaze to Antoine, whose face was a mask of terror. "And you? You were to be my master. You were to count my children like livestock before they were even conceived." Finally, she looked back at Jean-Pierre, whose pale blue eyes were wide with a dawning, uncomprehending horror. "You built this house on the bones of my people. You built your fortune on our suffering. You believed you were a god, holding the power of life and death. Tonight, you learn what it is to be mortal. You learn what it is to be helpless." The retribution she delivered was not one of quick violence, but of slow, agonizing poetic justice. The poison from Le Souffle Tranquille did not cloud the mind. It left its victims fully conscious as it systematically destroyed their bodies from within, inducing a creeping paralysis that left them unable to move, to speak, to even cry out. They were trapped, silent witnesses to their own dissolution. It was the physical manifestation of the psychological state of enslavement, a living mind imprisoned in a body it could not control, a body that belonged to another's will. Élise did not offer them water to soothe their burning throats. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply stood there, watching, just as she had watched for years, a silent, patient observer. She forced Jean-Pierre to watch as his wife succumbed first, her breath rattling to a stop. She made him watch as his arrogant son and heir followed, a silent tear tracing a path through the sweat on his cheek. She made him watch as his 2 young children, innocent in years but beneficiaries of the same evil system, breathed their last. He was the architect of this dynasty of cruelty, and she forced him to witness its complete and utter annihilation before the poison finally claimed him. His last breath was a choked, desperate gasp, his wide, terrified eyes fixed on her face, a face that was as impassive and as final as death itself. In the suffocating silence of the grand mansion, the Dubois dynasty had come to an end. The following morning, the scene was discovered by a business associate who had an early appointment with Dubois. He found a house of the dead. The sight that greeted him was one of silent, orderly horror. The family lay in their beds, their expressions peaceful in death, the swiftness of the poison having left no marks of struggle. Dr. Renaud, summoned again, was now more certain than ever of his initial, convenient diagnosis. In the oppressive heat of a New Orleans summer, decomposition was swift. Any subtle signs that might have contradicted his conclusion would be quickly erased by nature itself. A fulminant cholera, he wrote in his official report, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence. The city's authorities, eager to prevent a panic among the wealthy elite, readily accepted his verdict. The disappearance of a single enslaved girl, Élise, was noted in the constabulary log. The official theory was that she had panicked at the sight of the sickness and had fled into the city. It was a plausible, simple explanation that required no further investigation. No one thought to question why a slave would flee a house where her masters were dead, a situation that might have been a pathway to freedom. Her disappearance was a loose end that no one in a position of power had any interest in pulling. Within weeks, the truth of Jean-Pierre Dubois's financial situation came to light. The man who had projected an image of unassailable wealth was, in fact, massively in debt. His creditors descended like vultures, and the great Dubois estate, including the now infamous mansion and the vast sugar plantation of Belle Rêve, was broken up and sold off to pay his debts. The story of the family's sudden demise became a grim cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties, a reminder of the fragility of life in the fever-ridden city. Élise, however, had not fled. Flight to the north, the dream that had sustained Marcus, had never been her goal. Her plan was far more audacious, rooted in the very city that had been her prison. Her revenge was not merely an act of annihilation but also one of creation. Using a small cache of money she had painstakingly saved over years, supplemented by a handful of Madame Dubois's jewels and a pouch of gold coins she had taken from the master's study, she made her way not to the docks or the roads leading north, but to the Faubourg Marigny, a vibrant, eclectic neighborhood on the downriver side of the French Quarter. There, she sought out a man named Joseph Vincent, a respected notary and a free man of color whose own mother Élise's mother had once sheltered during a time of trouble. She presented herself to him not as Élise, the runaway slave, but as Madame Élise Beaumont, a recently widowed woman of color who had just arrived from Saint-Domingue, fleeing political instability with a modest inheritance. The story was plausible, the city full of such refugees. With Vincent's help, she used her money to purchase her own freedom, the legal documents meticulously crafted to erase her past and create a new identity. The transaction was a quiet, legalistic miracle. Élise, the property, ceased to exist. In her place stood Madame Beaumont, a free woman, a citizen, at least in the limited sense that a person of color could be in antebellum New Orleans. The story of the Dubois family's demise, though officially recorded as cholera, took on a life of its own in the slave quarters of the city and the surrounding plantations. It became a legend, a whispered tale of supernatural retribution. Some said a voodoo queen had put a curse on the house. Others claimed the ghosts of the slaves Dubois had worked to death had risen from their unmarked graves to claim his soul. The story, in all its variations, served a single, powerful purpose: it sowed a seed of fear in the hearts of the master class. Planters who had once been as careless and arrogant as Dubois became more watchful, more paranoid. A sudden illness, a strange taste in the food, the quiet, unreadable expression on a servant's face, everything became a potential threat. Élise's act of individual revenge had created a psychological ripple effect, subtly altering the balance of power. It was a new and terrifying thought for the oppressors, that the system of total control might have cracks, that the people they considered little more than beasts of burden might harbor thoughts, plans, and secrets of their own. As Madame Beaumont, Élise began the second, and more profound, phase of her life's work. She was intelligent, patient, and now, for the first time, free to use her mind for her own benefit. The years spent listening to Jean-Pierre Dubois's business dealings had given her an education in finance and speculation that was more practical than any offered at a university. She knew which shipping lines were sound, which land speculations were fraudulent, and which city lots, currently worthless swampland, were slated for future development according to the city's secret plans she had overheard. She began to invest, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. She purchased a small cottage in the Marigny, then a larger rental property. She loaned money, with interest, to merchants. She used intermediaries to buy and sell cotton futures, her decisions guided by the intricate knowledge she had gleaned as a ghost in the house of her enemy. Her wealth grew, slowly and steadily, then exponentially. Within a decade, Madame Élise Beaumont was one of the wealthiest free women of color in New Orleans, a respected, formidable businesswoman known for her shrewdness and her quiet, almost severe, demeanor. She lived elegantly but not extravagantly, her life a model of discipline and purpose. She used her immense and growing fortune for a single, secret purpose, the liberation of her people. She became a silent, powerful force in the city's clandestine abolitionist movement. Working through trusted agents, the notary Joseph Vincent, a sympathetic Quaker merchant, a free black ship captain, she began to purchase enslaved people from the auction blocks of the St. Louis Hotel. She would read the notices, her heart aching at the descriptions of strong young bucks and prime breeding wenches, the same language that had sealed her own resolve years before. She would send her agent to the auctions with specific instructions, buying entire families, preventing the separations that had destroyed her own childhood. Once purchased, she would have the notary draw up the papers of manumission, setting them free. She funded a network of safe houses for those fleeing the plantations. She paid for passage on ships bound for the north, for Haiti, for any place where the shadow of the lash did not fall. To the world, she was simply a remarkably successful Creole businesswoman. But in the enslaved community, a new legend began to grow, the legend of the Angel of Marigny. They spoke in hushed tones of a mysterious benefactor who plucked families from the jaws of the slave traders, a powerful spirit who fought back against the darkness. They never knew that the avenging angel who had brought down the house of Dubois and the benevolent angel who saved them from the auction block were one and the same woman. Her personal act of violent retribution had been transformed, through patience and planning, into a systemic act of liberation. In a final, stunning irony, her net worth, carefully calculated and recorded in her own private ledgers, eventually surpassed the highest valuation the Dubois estate had ever achieved. The enslaved woman had become richer and more powerful than her former master could ever have dreamed of being. Years passed. The nation was torn apart by civil war, and the city of New Orleans fell to the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation brought a new, chaotic, and hopeful dawn. Through it all, Élise continued her work, now more openly, helping the newly freed navigate the treacherous waters of their new existence. Long after the war, in the 1880s, the old Dubois mansion in the Garden District, having passed through many hands, was undergoing a major renovation. A carpenter, tearing up the floorboards in a small room at the back of the house, a room that had once been Élise, discovered a small, leather-bound journal. It was her journal, filled with entries written in a fine, elegant script. In its pages, she had detailed everything, the daily cruelties of the Dubois family, the specifics of her plan, the recipe for le souffle tranquille, and the cold, clear philosophy of justice that had guided her hand. The journal was turned over to the city's historical society, where a small committee of stunned white gentlemen read it in horrified silence. They recognized its explosive potential, the power of its testimony to undermine the carefully constructed narrative of the benevolent master and the contented slave. The journal was declared a clever forgery, a piece of inflammatory abolitionist propaganda, and it was sealed away in a vault, its truth buried under layers of official denial. The story concludes not in the grand mansion of her oppressors, but on the wrought iron balcony of her own elegant home in the French Quarter, a home she had purchased and filled with beauty. It is the late 1890s, and Élise is an old woman, a revered matriarch of the city's prosperous Creole community. She is a pillar of her church, a philanthropist, a symbol of resilience and success. She never married, never had children of her own, but she was the mother to hundreds she had freed, the matriarch of a sprawling family bound not by blood, but by a shared deliverance. She rarely, if ever, spoke of her life before she became Madame Beaumont. The past was a locked room, its secrets known only to her. But sometimes, as she sat on her balcony in the cool of the evening, watching the gaslights flicker to life on the street below, she would remember. She would remember the suffocating heat of the cane fields, the cold blue eyes of her master, and the proud, defiant face of a man named Marcus. The memories were not ghosts that haunted her, they were the foundation stones upon which her entire life had been built. Jean-Pierre Dubois had constructed an empire of cruelty on a foundation of human bones, an empire that had crumbled into dust and debt in a single night. Élise, who had started with nothing but a forbidden knowledge of letters and a memory that would not die, had built a lasting legacy of freedom, a testament to the quiet, indomitable power of a single human will. For in a city built on chains, the most powerful weapon was not the whip or the gun, but a memory that refused to forget, and a mind that had learned the long, slow, and perfect mathematics of revenge.